All right.
Oh, that's a lot of participants.
Yeah. I know, they're rolling in. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Director. Thank you so much for joining us for our event with Restore the North Woods and Jamie Sayen. For those that do not know us, the Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and this past April, we celebrated 34 years. This event is also sponsored by Restore the North Woods. This is a Zoom webinar, so you are only able to see the hosts and the panelists. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're having any tech difficulties, and I'll do my best to help you out. And you can also use the chat function to correspond with each other. There will be an audience Q&A during the last 15 minutes or so of our event, so please enter any questions throughout in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to those later. And I will now turn the program over to Michael Kellett, Executive Director of Restore, who will give a brief update and introduction about his organization, and then to tonight's speaker. Now over to you, Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being online. I'm Michael Kellett. I'm Executive Director of Restore the North Woods. We've been around since 1992, and our major focus is creating new parks and wildland protected areas, protecting wildlife, and protecting forests. And we were very involved from the very beginning with proposing a new national park in the Maine woods, protecting the wolf and the Atlantic salmon, and we're now involved in protecting forests in Massachusetts. But this is about Jamie Sayen's presentation. And when I first came to New England from Michigan in 1987, I was reading this stuff by this guy, Jamie Sayen, and it looked really interesting. He was talking about wildlands and all kinds of things in the Northeast. And so I talked to I was working for the Wilderness Society at the time. I talked to my fellow conservation community people, and they said, oh, this guy, he's a radical. He's really just way out there. He's talking about really extreme stuff. And so I looked at what was he talking about? He was talking about protecting large wildlands, that publicly owned wildlands across the region, and allowing the forests to recover and protecting those forests. He's talking about restoring endangered wildlife, especially wolves and panthers and Canada lynx and so forth. He was talking about how, you know, we need to buy out these big companies that own all these millions of acres of land and protect most of it, but include locally sustainable forestry around the communities up here. And I said, you know, that really doesn't seem that crazy to me. That's actually seems pretty good. And so I started working basically on that same agenda. And guess what? Today, all of the stuff that he was talking about is totally mainstream, at least in terms of what scientists are saying and what more visionary conservationists are saying. So Jamie is a true visionary, and there aren't that many of them. So you're lucky to hear from him with his insights on how the journey he's made in the North Woods. And he's lived there for a long time. He knows the people and the land and the forests. So I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, and then at the end, we're going to talk about what you can do to help and get involved and so forth. So Jamie, welcome. Pleased to introduce you.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I could say something quite similar about you. You have been one of my most trusted colleagues and great friends for 35 years and counting. And I'm looking forward to the next 35 years. And I would just say that if an idea's time is right and the status quo is out of joint with reality, then then proposals that radically diverge from the status quo are not what is radical. I'm going to have a slide presentation, but first I want to give you just a little bit of background. And I wrote this book, Children of the Northern Forest, published about a year ago, and it is about much of the work that Michael and I and Jim St. Pierre and so many other great folks have been engaged in for all this time. And it really is a kind of a macroeconomic look at the forests, the ecology, and the culture of northern New England. And by northern New England, I primarily mean the area that was dominated by the paper companies in the northern half of Maine, Coos County, where I live in northern New Hampshire, and the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. About 6 or 7 years ago, I wrote a book called You Had a Job for Life, which was about the Groveton paper mill just down the road from me, that was founded in 1891 and was shut down by global forces in 2007. I conducted an oral history project, and the stories that I was told by the mill workers were so amazing, and they were so generous in their stories, that I had a very easy job writing this book as long as I stayed out of the way of their stories. It's a kind of a micro look at one of the elements of the northern forest. And so in a way, Job for Life comes first. It's succeeded by Children of the Northern Forest. And now the next logical path for me is natural democracy, which is the topic of our discussion tonight. And the subtitle, Democracy and Nature, really has to do with the fact that it bothered me that we supposedly live in a democracy, although I think most of us share some real concerns about the possibility of electing a climate and science denier to the presidency, and much of the other nonsense that's going on right now. But I wonder if, even on its best times, that democracy is very capable of addressing existential crises such as climate change, the sixth extinction event, and environmental injustice. And I see very little reason to be optimistic that democracy, as currently constituted, will do that. And so tonight's talk is proposing an alternative way of looking at both nature and politics. And Thoreau, as always, is way ahead of us all. These two quotes, I think, capture what I'm thinking and feeling. I believe that there is a subtle magnetism in nature, which, if we unconsciously yield to it, will direct us aright. Let us be led by nature. And this very radical resistance to civil government comment: any man more right than his neighbor constitutes a majority of one already. That sounds very anti-democratic, but what Thoreau is doing is making a really important point, which is that in matters of ethics, and I add science, we don't take a referendum to see whether an ethical behavior should be the norm. And we also don't take a referendum on, say, do we accept the law of gravity? We operate within those constraints. And freedom actually is embracing limitations, natural and physical and ethical limitations. And this is one of the things about Thoreau's essay that I find so inspiring. The other thing about resistance to civil government is that he was writing about, as an abolitionist, about slavery in the 1840s and 50s. And I've learned a great deal about environmental work from studying the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement. I think that I don't presume to speak for Thoreau, but I do think that if he were here among us, he would be very much of the biocentric view that nature has rights. And I think that his reading a close reading of him, we would find many examples of that. So I don't think I'm misinterpreting his thoughts. I find it interesting that both tragedy, theater, and democracy were born in 5th century Athens, BCE. And both I think rely on us telling stories. And democracy, of course, is self-rule. Tragedy, my working definition, there are many others, acceptance of non-negotiable limits without compromising our ethical obligations. And I think that's really the challenge that we face in shaping a democracy that works for wild nature as well as for humans. Aldo Leopold, in his great essay, The Land Ethic, goes on at some length detailing the expansion of rights since the days of the Greeks and slavery. And for the purposes of American history, this is a very brief and obviously somewhat selective summary, but at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, white male property owners were the voters. By 1840, the vote had been granted essentially to all white males. In 1870, the 15th Amendment assured the voting rights of former male slaves. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment finally allowed women to vote. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, which has largely been gutted by our Supreme Court recently, assured the rights guaranteed a century earlier in the 15th century to all African Americans, and in fact to all American citizens. And then in 2015, gay marriage rights were acknowledged. We are now backsliding on all of these, I think, but we still haven't addressed the rights of nature, climate change, and the sixth extinction event. When are we going to do that? Gary Lawless is a great poet from the Gulf of Maine, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his wonderful work. About 30 years ago, I interviewed him for the Northern Forest Forum, and these quotes I have from him are, I think, still applicable. He said, "The planet is trying to educate us." And then he talked about community and conversation. A community is really a conversation. And if you aren't allowing all the voices to be present, then the community is out of balance. It can't heal itself until all the voices are present and no one voice is in control. We could talk about that on human terms, or as I would like to do, we can expand this to planetary terms. That heron in that picture has as much right to habitat and the right to life as I do. And yet we don't have any way, we don't seem to have found any way to listen to what heron might have to say. Now, I'm going to have a little trouble reading this next quote because I've got a couple of faces blocking part of it. So I can read you. When you acknowledge something to everyone, all of a sudden, blank, blank, blank changes because you have to, blank, 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 of talking about who you are, blank, blank, blank. Now I can see and what you're doing. Once you acknowledge that connection, you realize that a lot of what you're doing there isn't so good, and that's okay. You don't have to feel guilt about that, but you have to feel humility about that and start to make changes. We can help each other make changes. Mutual aid isn't such a bad idea, but it isn't just about humans. And I think this is really, really critical that when you start to acknowledge your connection with everything, you really do start to see the world differently. Your language does change, and your response to situations also changes. So when Michael and I were being dismissed as radicals, I felt that I was humbly trying to do right by the heron and lichens and wolves and rivers and all the great wonders of wildlife. So it didn't strike me that it was radical to protect the rights of a beautiful heron or anyone else who isn't human. Uh, okay, so we need a new politics modeled on wild nature, and I think that quote of Thoreau's that I gave at the beginning really leads us to that. And nature, I think, does entice us, seduce us into listening to what she has to say, observing what she's doing. And nature teaches us to respect, and again, I can't quite see that word. I'm sorry about this. I wish I were more technologically advanced, but I take Thoreau's hostility to technology rather too seriously. Um, so, Michael, what does that say? Nature teaches respect. Oh, I can't hear you either.
Sorry, I muted him. So
Oh.
nature teaches respect for powers greater than us.
Okay, thank you. I apologize.
And yeah, we can jump in whenever, Jamie. So
Okay, thank you. So we are obliged to abide by non-negotiable natural laws and limits. This isn't optional. We can't repeal the law of gravity. We can't violate for long the laws of carrying capacity. Consequences happen when we do, and climate change is a great example, as is, of course, habitat degradation and the extinction events that we're suffering. So we really, to begin to have a natural democracy, we have to embrace our ethical obligations to all species and to unborn generations. Now, this obviously poses some challenges if you want to be a literalist about this. But I'm not suggesting that we need voting booths for lichens and whales, although I do propose one later on. And I also don't propose interviewing unborn generations, but I suspect that if our generation had been asked, do you mind growing up in a world where the passenger pigeon is extinct? Few of us would have said, sure, go ahead. But we weren't consulted. So how do we find proxies for consulting unborn generations? And how do we find proxies for having an English language conversation with this cougar? And finally, this quote from Thoreau comes from the Maine woods, and it happened. It was his response to descending from Mount Katahdin, and there was there felt the presence of a force not bound to be kind to man, and I think this is really important. We feel we are important, but nature really doesn't. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we are a force that is bound to be kind to wild nature, even if wild nature is not bound to be kind to us. And I think that if we are kind to wild nature, it actually will be a lot kinder to us than we might otherwise deserve. So the elements of natural democracy are very similar to, at least the first two, to what we would expect if we were talking about human democracy or, say, democracy in the USA. A vote for all and an informed electorate. There are other elements that we could put in, such as equality and setting the agenda, the political agenda. And then the third one that I think is especially pertinent to natural democracy is land reform. And I think the critters in this picture, I'm hoping the critters in this picture will enjoy and perhaps even agree with some of what I'm saying tonight. Now, I'm going to go through them one by one. So a vote for all species and unborn generations. Non-humans teach us, if we're listening, to pare our desires down to the essentials, such as food, habitat, and health. This I think is not unlike the great chapter in Walden called Economy, where Thoreau focuses on the essentials and spends pages and pages mocking the wealthy for their uncomfortable clothes that they only wear once, and for the improved means to an unimproved end represented by the train then, and many other things today. And here's where I think the abolitionists and African American advocates for civil rights have been so helpful in my thinking, and that is Frederick Douglass in one of his three autobiographies. I looked upon suffrage to the Negro as the only measure which could prevent him from being thrust back into slavery. And I think that we need to apply that to the heron and to all species, because otherwise, if they don't have some kind of a say in how we operate, we're going to ignore their plight. And we have been doing this for millennia, and the results are not pretty. W.E.B. Du Bois, in The Souls of Black People, wrote, "The best arbiters of their own welfare are the persons directly affected. Consequently, that is only by arming every hand with a ballot with the right to have a voice in the policy of the state that the greatest good to the greatest number could be attained." Well, I want the best for that heron, but I am not the best arbiter of its welfare, aside from assuming that if enough wild habitat is available to maintain all of it, to meet all of its needs, that it will certainly be better off than if I presume to know better than the heron what is best for the heron. And then here's a picture of what I think is the proper voting booth for all species. Informed electorate. This picture was drawn by John Luoma, a great artist from Maine. When we were fighting herbicide spraying of forests back in the 90s, the paper companies would clear cut the land, then they would plant softwood species, then they would spray to kill any deciduous growth and to speed up the growth of the crop. And this picture, of course, captures perfectly the effect on the animals. Here they are reading the sign and no doubt abiding by it. An informed electorate in natural democracy needs citizens who can read the landscape as well as they can read books. And one of the real scary things in contemporary America is the love affair. I'm not saying we shouldn't do research on molecular biology, but the trend of reducing funding for natural history education at all levels is catastrophic. And as Frederick Douglass said, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. And that's a pretty important thing. Knowledge is a key to freedom. Let me see where I am here on this. Okay. Now, land reform, and this is really where things get a little bit different from perhaps conventional talks about democracy and in among people. We have to reform not only land ownership patterns, but our attitudes toward land. So we have to stop treating the land as a commodity resource. Many of you are probably familiar with Aldo Leopold's great statement that we abuse land because we treat it as a commodity to be exploited. Only when we treat it as a community to which we belong will we cease to abuse the land. We also need to reverse the maldistribution of wealth and land ownership in this country. In our lifetime, it has gone from moderate maldistribution to extreme maldistribution. And the large global investors who came after the paper companies in northern Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont are simply bodies of capital looking to exploit the land and have no commitment to the land, and enjoy many public subsidies that enable them to make these investments. We have to tax externalities. In other words, the bad actors and the polluters must pay the costs, not society or the land. And of course, if we did tax externalities, many of the really bad operations, the clear cutting, the large absentee ownership of forest lands would cease, because these guys don't make their profits off of cutting trees. Sadly, they've degraded the forest so much that it's not really that profitable. But if we throw in a lot of tax breaks, low property taxes, allowing them to degrade the water and the air and the land, it does become profitable. I don't understand how, but it does. And ultimately, what land reform means is reclaiming the public commons for all species and for unborn generations. And this is where, of course, Restore's Maine Woods National Park is such a critical contribution to this conversation. Not only would a 3.2 million acre national park be a wonderful place for recreation and a real cornerstone, the real infrastructure of a low impact, low carbon recreation and tourism economy in northern New England. But these lands are so critical for carbon storage and for biodiversity protection, for species migrating to escape warming climatic conditions. We need a lot of north-south and plenty of east-west mobility for these critters to optimize their chances for survival as we heat the planet. This map is really an important historical document. It was put together by the Northern Forest Land Study in 1988 to study the patterns of land ownership in the area, because it was becoming clear by then that the paper companies were going to be selling out very soon. And in fact, by 2004, all 9.7 million acres, or just about all of the 9.7 million acres in the Adirondacks and northern New England that were owned by the industrial owners, the paper companies, had been sold. So it happened very quickly. And this map shows three kinds of ownerships. So the large private are these, the bigger dots. And particularly in Maine, you can see how much of the land is owned by the large private owners. Public lands, you can see the White Mountain National Forest, a lot of public land in the Adirondacks, and Baxter State Park, and some other stuff. And then the white, in other words, the unmarked or unspeckled stuff, is privately owned land in relatively small amounts, the small woodlot owners, we'll call them. And we'll come back to this later. Obstacles that work for to a democracy that works for wild nature include racism and genocide, resourcism, which I think is kind of the twin of racism. In both cases, we commodify the other and we exploit them, and we take away any freedom or rights that they might have. Our huge carbon footprint is obviously a huge obstacle. And this idea of American exceptionalism, I think, has been really crippling. And you can't run for president without, deferring to it. But let's be honest, American prosperity is due to the seizure in colonial times and then on into through the 19th and 20th century of a largely unexploited continent. We then commodified nature and labor, and we privatized the wealth of nature's wealth for the benefit of the few, the corporations and the super wealthy. The beaver kind of symbolizes this because it was the first global commodity traded in the early colonial period. And as the beaver were driven to extinction or extirpated from an area, the ecology changed radically, and that had a profound impact on hundreds and hundreds of species that thrived in beaver ponds, beaver meadows, and associated ecosystems. It also destroyed the indigenous cultures where beaver trapping was so predominant. And yet when the beaver came back, the healing began immediately. So the beaver are both a kind of a legacy of what went wrong early on when the Europeans came here, and a symbol of hope. This beaver, incidentally, was about 5 feet from my canoe when I was standing and looking at a heron booming in the spring. And the beaver decided to see if he could cause me to fall out of the canoe. I actually did not, but I did get a nice picture of him. Okay, let me just checking my notes here to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. So a government, and this is from Thoreau again, a government that condones injustice is illegitimate. And I think that is a true statement. And we unfortunately live under a government that condones injustice in all too many ways. All men realize the right of revolution, that is, the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. That's Thoreau in Resistance to Civil Government. And then 100 years later, James Baldwin, writing during the Civil Rights Movement, wrote, "For power truly to feel itself menaced, it must somehow sense itself in the presence of another power, or more accurately, an energy which it is not known how to define and therefore does not really know how to control." And I think that natural democracy can liberate energy that global capital and autocrats are incapable of comprehending or controlling. All they know how to do is suppress it. And I think we who acknowledge non-negotiable limits and laws wield the power of reality, which ultimately will prevail. And Thoreau pointed out that a minority is powerless while it conforms to the majority. It is not even a minority then, but it is irresistible when it clogs by its whole weight. That's our job, to clog by its whole weight, to stay true to what is ethical and scientifically true. Now, this biomass clear cut occurred about a decade ago, about 2 miles from my house. By the standards of the industrial clear cuts in northern Maine, this is kind of small potatoes, but this should, any government that permits this sort of thing should be viewed as illegitimate. So how do we reorganize government to meet nature's needs? Thoreau asserted that governments are expedients that should leave citizens alone. And then here is really where he gets down to work. A government in which the majority rule in all cases cannot be based on justice, even as far as men understand it. Can there not be a government in which majorities do not virtually decide right and wrong, but conscience, in which majorities decide only those questions to which the rule of expediency is applicable? And this goes back to the quote I had at the beginning, that a man who is more right than his neighbor already constitutes a majority of one. In other words, if an abolitionist was already more right than the thousands of people who were cursing him, because he was more right than they on a moral issue. And the same applies to nature and to its non-negotiable laws and limits. We either respect them and abide by them, or we have trouble. And I couldn't resist this. Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? And I will leave it to you to answer the question I pose. So how do we bring about this democracy? Uh, and I think, let's have a Congress of all species and the unborn. I've already admitted that that's not realistic in the sense of convening in voting booths or in Congress or something like that. But I think there are pretty easy ways to get at what is essential. And if we could ask the critters in this picture, what is essential for your life? They would say something along the lines of adequate, viable habitat that meet all of our life's needs. And I don't think it's any more complicated than that. And unborn generations um, would say we want atmospheric carbon levels reduced to 350 parts per million, just as I would have preferred to have been able to observe the passenger pigeon. So I don't think it's that complicated, but we have to pay attention to what Earth is saying, what the critters are saying, and we have to stay true to our best understanding of the ethics and the science involved. So aligning human desires with planetary limits leads to three fundamental questions. What are the needs of the land? How do we transform human behavior that is responsible for climate, biodiversity, and environmental justice crises? And how do we meet basic economic needs? And an important point here is that before addressing question 3, which is the only one that our politics seems interested or capable in addressing, we must satisfactorily answer questions 1 and 2. And this requires the approach of natural democracy. Let me see if I had any. Okay. So, what are the needs of the land? Let me stop for a moment and talk about this picture. I was in Canada last year, and we saw a loon chick, the one on the left, and a couple of hundred yards off, we saw an adult, the one on the right, with a small fish in its mouth. And we saw the two of them coming together closer and closer. And then the chick went crazy and just practically flew. And this is the moment when the fish exchanged from the adult to the chick. And I'm not sure what this picture means about what are the needs of the land, but clearly meeting needs such as food are one of them. What the land needs is large blocks of unmanaged lands that meet life needs of all native species, reducing atmospheric carbon levels, and a reduced human population and consumption. An application of that question, what are the needs of the land, is what I'm about to talk about. And that is the Maine Woods National Park, as I've already discussed, is an answer to the question, what are the needs of the land of a particular area in northern Maine? In 1995, I proposed a headwaters wilderness reserve, which is the kind of the yellow shaded area that stretches down into Vermont and New Hampshire, as well as most of the northwestern part of Maine. These are all lands that were owned by paper companies or other large non-industrial investors where there are no year-round populations, no occupation. So in other words, nobody would be kicked off the land. And it would be an opportunity to rewild these large sections. I believe it was and is the highest and best use of those lands. And it would restore the public commons and anchor future New England Wildland Reserve from inner city to the Allagash. Now, that's an idea that really needs to be developed. An idea of a Wildlands Reserve from, say, inner Boston, inner Hartford, that connects wildlands all the way up to the Allagash and to Lake Champlain and Long Island Sound and all places in between. Now, the way I came up with this 8.7 million acre headwaters wilderness reserve system was I simply mapped all of the absentee owned lands and then put major roads in and said, voila, we have 16 possible reserves that are separated by some major roads that are not likely to be closed down anytime soon. This proposal is not in conflict with the Maine Woods National Park, because the Maine Woods National Park hopefully will be established, and they would complement each other. The park would be the real center of the recreation and tourism, as well as playing a major role in biodiversity, climate mitigation, and environmental justice. The rest of the headwaters would perhaps focus more, but not exclusively, on biodiversity, carbon storage, and environmental justice, but would also be an asset for recreation. So I see them not as in competition, but as trying to do slightly different things. How do we transform human behavior? And again, I think I've discussed many of these. We renounce racism and resourcism and environmental justice. That requires the renouncing of the commodification of land and labor. Also demand reduction, and this is really a critical point. It is essential that we use less energy, that we consume fewer products, that we make fewer demands on wild nature. So we need to reduce our demand for energy, for wood products, and for just all around junk. I firmly believe that 99% of the stuff sold in Walmarts and any other box store probably should not have been manufactured. So demand reduction is a huge item. We talk about a little bit about conservation and efficiency, but we don't talk so much about just questioning, should I buy this thing? Should I walk rather than get in the car? All of these things. And then tax externalities, and terminate public subsidies to degrading practices. If we could get a study of the federal and state governments, I think we would all be shocked by how much of our public funds, our taxpayer money, is going to subsidize really, really bad projects, whether it's like another oil pipeline from Alberta, or just rewarding clear cutters for degrading air, water, and land. If we took away those subsidies, public subsidies, the large landowners would flee the area, because their profit depends on these subsidies. The biomass industry, which has already collapsed of its own, would have collapsed a lot sooner without the billions of dollars that were given to it. So if we take away those public funds from harmful practices, that's step one of improving the situation. Then we redirect those public subsidies to acquire more land for the public commons, to develop a low carbon value, low impact, value adding economy in the rural areas that have been so hard hit and so left behind in this region. But really, one of the things that I firmly believe from my experience of writing about the Groveton paper mill is that the stories were peculiar to Groveton, but in fact, they've been played out in cities and rural areas throughout the country and throughout the world. And that's what globalization does to rural resource colonies such as us. And how do we meet basic economic needs, human economic needs? And this is where I think that a lot of the criticism of the Headwaters proposal and the Maine Woods National Park is, oh, it's going to cost us jobs. Where are we going to get the wood fiber? And on and on and on. Well, actually, if we reduce demand and we change from reliance on low grade commodities that earn next to nothing and focus on high value adding manufacturing opportunities that benefit local communities, this becomes possible. And so let's look at this map again. And let's pretend that much of this shaded area in northern New England does become wildlands. Not all of it, but let's pretend that a big chunk of it does. Where do we get the wood that our region needs and also needs to export? Well, all these little white places down by the in Maine, south of the industrial forest, and kind of on the periphery along the Connecticut River in Vermont and New Hampshire, and then moving right on down into southern and central Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. That's where we can focus our new economy that is all about adding value to high quality saw logs. So we can practice low impact forestry and make a profit. Right now, low impact forestry does not make a profit because of the externalities. Low impact forestry actually is internalizing externalities, only it's being punished by our government and our tax policies and our environmental policies. So if we were to change that, then we would discover that low impact forestry and high value adding would actually be far more economically beneficial than the current economy and the economy of the last 100 years. This would require all of New England to play a role. Population centers obviously need to focus on demand reduction, and rural communities need to let go of the kind of the dominant paradigm that's run their lives for well over a century, and embrace low impact forestry and value adding. Obviously, the population centers are major customers, and they should insist on only really high quality products that are harvested by the lowest of impact practices. So this is my last slide, and it's the Gay Brook, which is just out behind our house. I took a walk there a couple hours ago. When my son was 3 months old, it was March, and it had been quite a cold winter, and it was a warm day, but there was still a foot or more of snow on the ground. And I took him for his first big walk in the woods, and he was all bundled up, and we walked up the Gay Brook till we came to a 6-foot waterfall that was thundering because the snow was melting in the warm temperatures. And it was just a really wild and noisy scene. And I unbuckled him and turned him around and held him out to look at the waterfall. And for a few moments, he was kind of non-responsive. And then suddenly his arms and his feet started wiggling and his mouth started going, wah, 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 wah. And he wouldn't stop until finally my arms got tired and I had to settle him down and put him back in the harness. That told me something about our affinity for wild nature. I hadn't had a chance to coach him. And this was his first experience with wild water and wild nature. And it was clear that he was totally excited about that. How is it that we allow ourselves to lose that innocent love of nature? And how do we go about making sure that the children of tomorrow don't lose that love? Some of us have been lucky and we didn't grow up, and so we've retained some of that love. But the most important and happiest times in my life are when I'm immersed in wild nature and let nature do the talking. So to that end, we need to realign our desires and actions with our instinctive affection for wild nature. And finally, let's give Thoreau the last word. The most alive is the wildest. All things good are wild and free. And then I'm going to read you something that you're familiar with, but perhaps not all of it. And what I've been preparing to say is that in wildness is the preservation of the world. Every tree sends its fibers forth in search of the wild. The cities import it at any price. Men plow and sail for it. From the forest and wilderness come the tonics and barks which brace mankind. Our ancestors were savages. The story of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf is not a meaningless fable. The founders of every state which has risen to eminence have drawn their nourishment and vigor from a similar wild source. It was because the children of the empire were not suckled by the wolf that they were conquered and displaced by the children of the northern forests who were. I read that as a cautionary tale, and I hope that we pay heed. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Jamie, and thanks for that anecdote at the end. That I would have been fine if that was the last word, but happy you gave it to Thoreau as well. So we have lots of questions coming in. I'm going to get right in there and ask you them. And just a reminder to everyone still on to place your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So first one, white culture's nature is killing the buffalo for its tongue and hide. Same with every resource we've abused, from forests to fish, from redwoods to cod. Why should anyone think that this will ever change? We are terminally stupid, which has caught up with the present, never mind the future. Do you have comments on this?
I go through moments of despair when I think about the cruelty and stupidity of the governing powers, political and economic and cultural. But I don't think that that's an option. I'm a grandfather, and I think I want my grandkids and their grandkids to have a chance to enjoy the naturalness, the wildness of nature. So I think we have to fight. And I think that when we despair, we're really kind of helping the despoilers and the bad actors. So I don't dispute what the individual wrote, but I think the only thing I can do is try to contribute to making things better and trying to get us to think a little differently.
And next question. There is currently an industrialization of the Maine coast by large global wind power. They are degrading the marine life and mammals. We need to protect the Maine coast just as much as wild forests. Do you know who is watching and protecting the Maine coastline today from exploitation?
Well, I'm sure Jim St. Pierre could give you a better answer than I could to that. I completely agree with the premise, though, that we're putting energy production ahead of the health of wild nature. And that's why I think demand reduction is so critically important. It may not sound sexy, but it really is. It's our demand for things, whether it's energy or cars or, boom boxes or, handheld devices, or just frivolous, let's go for a trip to the mall kind of activities that's driving all this stuff. And so providing more energy, even if it's of a lower carbon variety, is not the answer. The answer is reducing demand and obviously replacing fossil fuels with low impact energy sources, decentralized as much as possible. And also, I think that the manufacturers of solar panels and windmills should be honest about the carbon footprint of their products.
And how can we get public officials to recognize the need to respect and protect nature?
I think a really good way, if we could persuade them, is take them for a walk in the woods. If they get into a canoe, I'd take them for a paddle. In other words, the great conservationist David Brower uh, once lamented, and I think he's not alone in this, that the things we save are the things we know and love. And as a result, we have allowed the desecration and degradation of things that we didn't know. Small, little insects that lose their habitat, or the Glen Canyon on the Colorado River. Brower didn't know that, and he fought to stop a dam further upstream because he did know that land, and he spent the rest of his life regretting that he had not fought harder for lands he didn't know. So I think it's really important for people to drag your representatives out there. The ATV people get them to come out and joyride. They love that, but I'm not so sure that they're willing to come out and walk with us. They don't have to climb Mount Washington, but just to walk along a stream and talking about some of the interesting things that change with the seasons and whatnot, I think would help a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never heard that answer, although the question comes up a lot. So this one might be a little bit of a hard question, but I'm gonna ask it anyways. Nice idea about North Woods in northern New England. However, Roxanne Quimby of Burt's Bees, before they sold out, tried to give her wild mainland to the government for a national park near Baxter State Park in Mount Katahdin. She failed. How do you think that you won't?
Well, I don't think she failed. Her land is now the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. It may not be a national park, and it may not be 3.2 million acres, but it's a hell of a lot more land than I've ever protected. And I think the real failure was the politicians who pandered to the absentee owners and also stirred up the fears of the local rural residents, my neighbors. You're going to lose your jobs. They're going to take away this from you and take away that from you. And so it was really a conspiracy of vested interests to slander her. But she persisted, and she deserves credit for that. And it was an act of generosity on her part. She got a lot of grief, and we got close to 100,000 acres that she also not only bought, but she endowed after she gave it away. I mean, this is a really extraordinary act of Wildlands philanthropy. And no, it didn't solve all the problems with one fell swoop, but it's exactly she's a role model for us. I bet that to segue over to Baxter State Park, the only governor in the history of Maine that any school kid can name, other than the current one or maybe the last two or three, is Percival Baxter, who was governor over 100 years ago now. And that's because of his active wildlands philanthropy that has so benefited the citizens of Maine and outsiders like me who love to go there. So I don't have. I mean, it's a long, hard slog. It's very frustrating. It was ridiculous and insulting and appalling the way they treated her. But they also exposed themselves as real hypocrites. Mary Adams fought the ban clear-cutting referendum because the paper company's land was their land. And she fought Roxanne's proposal for a park because the lands that Roxanne owned belonged to the people of Maine. In other words, private property rights was a one-way street for Mary Adams and not a two-way street. So the hypocrisy, I mean, that's a weak argument if you have to resort to that kind of hypocrisy. So I think it's important for people like Roxanne to do this because they expose the bad faith of the people who are in the way. We don't win it all immediately, but this is yet another step in the way if we persist.
I have a few more to ask, so last call for anyone who wants to enter a question in the Q&A or chat. So the next one, who are your environmental influences besides Thoreau?
Well, some are living and some are dead. Michael Kellett, Jim St. Pierre, Mitch Lansky are among my longest, my closest friends and colleagues, and 35 years and counting. Some of the old timers, Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold. I had the good fortune to know David Brower in his later years, and he was an extraordinary and wonderful human being. I worked very closely with Dave Foreman, the kind of the epitome of the early Earth First movement, but later the founder of the Wildlands project, and really a major leader in the rewilding movement. And in recent times, a lot of other people, but what most inspires me about them is their humility and their frustration that they haven't been able to do more.
That's a good list. Okay, so last
Stick
question.
around long enough and you meet everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you named current people. That's nice. Or living, I should say. In far western Kentucky, there are ongoing efforts to convert national forests into preserves under the Department of Interior in Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, etc. How might we reunite these efforts? Is it possible to do this under the USDA?
The USDA is a real challenge because it is a real commodity agriculture organization that, for political reasons that go back well over 100 years, includes the Forest Service, which is really not agriculture. You plant a crop and you plant it every year. A forest, you're dealing with trees that can be 300 and 400 years old, maybe older. It's not the same thing. And unfortunately, the mindset in the Department of Agriculture is very much commodity driven, subsidized agribusiness. And in the U.S. Forest Service, which would be in charge, it's a classic example of agency capture. The timber industry captured the Forest Service a long, long time ago. The Forest Service really does not like wilderness. They are managers of forests, and managers think they know what's best for the forest. The wisest managers know that they don't really understand the forest, and so they listen to what the forest is telling them. Unfortunately, to make a big paycheck, you manage the forest because you know what's best. So if the Forest Service puts these lands in wilderness, great. But read the fine print to make sure that they don't also allow ATVs and snowmobiles in the wilderness, because that's not wilderness. Or that they can cut trees because a pine borer comes or something like that. Wilderness means leave it alone. And so if that's what they're talking about, I wish them well. And I also urge the citizens who care about the particular parcels to, in Reagan's words, trust but verify, and be vigilant and never slack up, because they will backslide if we're not looking.
Yeah. All right, I want to be mindful of your time, Jamie, and everyone at home. So we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering all these great questions. I posted 2 links to Jamie's books that he discussed tonight in the chat. And those are the 2 books that he showed in the beginning as well. And Michael, I think you wanted to just say a quick note about one or both of those books.
And thanks, Jamie. And all I want to say is it would be great for people to read Jamie's books. And he's been generous enough to donate a number of signed books to Restore the North Woods that if you send us a $50 donation or do it online, we will send you one of Jamie's books, Children of the Northern Forest, signed by Jamie. Our web address is restore.org. And you can just click on donate in the upper right corner. And if you donate $50, or if you send us a check, and it will tell you on our website the address, we'd be happy to send you a book. And it's really a great book, and it's something that I think will inspire people. And you can help restore a little bit too by donating. So all I got to say is thanks, Jamie. You've been an inspiration for decades. And what's really amazing is Jamie hasn't lost any of his vision, and that's pretty difficult to do. So thank you.
Well, Michael, thank you. And you won't penalize them if they send you more than $50, will you?
No, that would be just fine.
And I posted the link for the Restored Donate page in the chat, everyone. So I'll leave that up for a couple minutes. And with that, thank you again on behalf of the Walden Woods Project and Restore. We work together a lot, so there'll be sure to be more virtual events and in-person events in the future. As Michael said, if you can donate to one or both of our organizations, we are so grateful. We continue to do our lectures for free. And on that note, keep checking walden.org for upcoming events. We have a few in-person events, and we'll have a few winter events that will likely be online as well. So again, thank you, Jamie and Michael, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.